Hello everybody, this is another video from Mr. Mitchell. Today we're going to talk about Russia. Russia is indeed the largest nation in the world. And if you can see on the map right here, it is much larger than all of Europe. Russia is this country right here. Now whenever we looked at maps of Europe, we only saw just a small portion of Russia. We saw pretty much from here over is the European side of Russia. But Russia extends all the way to the end of Asia. In fact, Alaska is going to be just right here. Alaska is actually going to be very close to this area of Russia. Well, anyway, Russia was, we're going to pick up in Russian history in about the 1400s. Russians finally drove the Mongols out. That was a group which had controlled them for a little bit. And the most important city at the time was Moscow. Now, Moscow is in the vicinity here. Now, Russia in the 1400s did not look near this big. Russia at the time was somewhere in the ballpark, and it's probably off to the left here, somewhere in the ballpark of these two lines. This was Russia at one point, just all this area right in the middle here. And all of this was uncontrolled by Russia at the time. The first czar, or emperor, of modern Russia was Ivan the Terrible. And you see him up here. Ivan the Terrible was indeed living up to his name. He was known for his cruelty. And during his 37 years as ruler, Russia was at war just about the whole time. Now, all of the czars from Ivan the Terrible in the 1500s all the way till Nicholas II were in charge of an unlimited government. You may remember that they had basically unlimited power, but you will see toward the last czar, they didn't have as much power as they did at the beginning with Ivan the Terrible. The czars were constantly in conflict with Roman landowners called the nobles. So the czars and nobles were almost in constant conflict with each other. The nobles were the ones that owned the big farms. They owned the land, and they were the wealthiest of Russians. So it just seems like throughout these hundreds of years, the landowners and the rulers didn't seem to get along. And that ultimately was part of what was some of Russia's downfall during the time. Those who opposed the czars were often murdered. I mean, the czars, especially starting with Ivan the Terrible, were particularly ruthless. Laws forced peasants to become serfs. So serfs were peasants, and the laws that were passed made peasants or serfs stay on the land of the nobles. They were unable to leave the nobles' lands. Nobles basically were the ones who owned the land. They were the landowners. And the peasants or the serfs were the ones who worked the land. Now, most of the people in Russia, of course, were serfs. You really didn't have a very large number of landowners. They were the people who, the serfs were the most common groups. We had another famous czar called Peter the Great, and you can see his picture off to the right. He was the czar in the 1680s to 1720s. He defeated Sweden and took over new land, and he built the city of St. Petersburg. Now, St. Petersburg is going to be right about here, and you probably can't tell it, but this is actually bordering the ocean right here. It's bordering this little inlet which comes in between Finland and Sweden and Norway. He called it St. Petersburg. Of course, his name was Peter. Probably had something to do with that, the name. St. Petersburg was there, and at the time it ended up being the capital of Russia, though Moscow is now. It was Russia's window to the West. See, Peter wanted closer ties with the European countries. He liked the European ideas and he liked European inventions. And he might have taken it a little overboard. He ordered Russians to dress like Europeans and even to shave off their beards, which was apparently the more European custom to go beardless. Well, anyway, we'll go to another notable czar, Catherine the Great. You can see her down at the bottom here. Catherine was a czar in the 1760s through 1790s. She also liked European ideas, and she also expanded the nation. See, these two, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, expanded the nation toward the west, toward Europe. She also expanded trade, and under Catherine the Great, Russia became a powerful nation, one of the more powerful nations in Europe. Peasants still led a hard life, even though Catherine the Great felt sympathy toward them and thought about freeing them. She still had to face the nobles. She knew that the nobles would very much dislike the servants or serfs being set free. So she ended up not doing that. Many nobles actually sent their children to schools in Germany and France. Many nobles did not speak Russian at home. And for many years, it was a divided nation. You had the nobles, which even had different culture, different languages, and then you had the serfs that were underneath them. Most Russians began, or many Russians began to dislike how serfs were being treated. This divide lasted many centuries, and there were flares of uprising and conflicts between the czars, the nobles, and the peasants who were just kind of the afterthought, the serfs. In 1914, World War I began. 1914, World War I began. And in World War I, Nicholas II was the czar at the time. Now, Nicholas II, I'll find my notes where I have that. Nicholas II ended up not really wanting to get in World War I, but the Russians did end up in World War I, and they suffered food shortages, and the workers went on strike. And the czars from the past had total control, but Nicholas II was not able to have total control. This country did what he didn't want them to do, and the army ended up turning on him, and revolutionaries turned on him. And Nicholas II and his entire family were shot. And that ended the 400-year rule of czars in Russia. Why don't we go to some questions? Here are the questions for this little section, this video. Number one, what two Russian cities did we mention? One of them was the capital at one point, and the other one is the capital now. Number two, who was that first czar? He was known for his cruelty. Number three, name two czars that expanded the country. Number four, what was the group that often opposed the czars? Number five, what were the names of the peasants that were forced to stay on land of the nobles? What were they called, those peasants? What were they called? Number six, who was that last Russian czar who was dethroned and killed around the time of World War I? Well, I hope you've learned a little bit about Russia.